Welcome back, my friends. This is video 3. We're going to finish up our magazine of Ben Franklin, pages 14 through 17. So if you don't already have your copy of your magazine, go ahead and grab it. Otherwise, let's get started on page 14 here. Patriot and statesman. Franklin wasn't only a printer, a publisher, a writer, an inventor, and a scientist. He was also one of the country's greatest leaders. In 1736, Franklin was made clerk of the Pennsylvania Assembly, the colony's governing body. He was elected to Philadelphia's City Council in 1748. In 1751, he joined the Pennsylvania Assembly as one of the city's representatives. There, he negotiated a major treaty, a formal agreement, with Native Americans. Later, he organized the defense of the Pennsylvania frontier. He also was chosen to be colonel of Philadelphia's militia regiment. In 1754, Ben drew up the first plan to unite the colonies under one government. Although his plan was rejected by the colonial assemblies and by the British Crown, it laid the foundation for what was to become the United States of America. This beautiful photo spanning both pages here reads, "For most of his life, Franklin's America was 13 colonies ruled by Britain. In 1764, when he was a representative of Pennsylvania, Franklin went to England. He argued the Pennsylvania's Assembly's cause before the king. The Assembly felt that the king's representatives were causing the people of Pennsylvania great hardships. In 1774, Ben was criticized before the Privy Council, advisors to the king. He was fired from his job as deputy postmaster. During these years, he fought to keep peace, both in Britain and at home." Bottom of page 14 here, this cartoon. In the late 1760s, Parliament sent troops to the New World to keep peace. It demanded that the colonists pay British taxes for this. But the colonists had no say in Parliament, which led to the outcry, "No taxation without representation." We're familiar with that. This image, spanning both pages as well, has this caption. On April 18th, 1775, British troops left Boston to seize weapons stored in Concord, Massachusetts. Paul Revere and others spread the word, "The British are coming." The next day, in nearby Lexington, the American Revolution began, with the shot heard around the world. Page 15. Right up here, it says, in 1765, Britain passed the Stamp Act. It forced colonists to buy stamps to put on newspapers, magazines, and even almanacs. The colonists felt this was unfair, especially since they had no representative in the British Parliament, where the laws were made. While in England, Franklin fought hard against the Stamp Act. He helped get it repealed or ended. These are probably the stamps. Another quote from his almanac, Poor Richard says, "Early to bed and early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise." Let's take a look at this photo. Do you know what's happening here? Dressed as Native Americans in a harbor, dumping something into the water. In December 1773, patriots, colonists, who supported American independence, dumped boatloads of tea into the Boston harbor. They were protesting Britain's tax on tea and other goods. This uprising was called the Boston Tea Party. Britain's response was so harsh that the patriots began to arm themselves. In this photo here, I think this is Franklin. Franklin played a big part of the Second Continental Congress. He served on many committees during the war. They included the committee that wrote the Declaration of Independence, the document that explained why America could no longer be tied to Britain. John Hancock was the first person to sign the Declaration. Before Hancock signed the document, Ben said, "Gentlemen, We must all hang together or else, most assuredly, we shall all hang separately. It kind of means like we need to stick together to get through this. And we're fighting for our independence. We're stronger together and we're at risk apart, alone. Last 2 pages of the magazine. Can't believe it already. Turn to pages 16 and 17. Bottom of page 16 reads The Revolutionary War and Beyond. After his return from England, Franklin was appointed a Pennsylvania delegate or representative to the Second Continental Congress. This group had a huge job. They had to hold the colonies together. They also had to change the military power of Britain. Ben knew the only way the colonists could win freedom from Britain was if they got some help, and the only nation likely to help them was France, Britain's enemy. Congress urged Franklin to represent them in Paris. Although he was past 70 years old and a widower, Ben sailed to France. The American cause was popular in Paris. Volunteers crossed the Atlantic to fight for the colonists. The French government also gave the colonists secret loans to buy guns. That was even before Franklin was able to work out a formal agreement with the French, which was signed in 1778. So let's look at most of page 16 and then part of page 17, this image here. It says, America's French allies played a big part in the siege of Yorktown, the last major battle of the Revolutionary War. The French fleet cut off British General Charles Cornwallis's army in Virginia from other British forces in the north. Next, a French army marched south with Washington's troops to trap the British. Cornwallis soon surrendered. So the French helped them win and make this into America. Top of page 17. Let's read this. Ben Franklin. I don't know what this part is here. Benny Franklin. When Franklin finally returned to Philadelphia, he was almost 80, yet he still had work to do. He chaired the Supreme Executive Council of Pennsylvania. He was a member of the Constitutional Convention, where he supported the Great Compromise, which established 2 houses of Congress, the Senate to represent the states and the House to represent the people. He also served as president of Pennsylvania Society for promoting the abolition of slavery. Some of his last writings attacked the detestable traffic of the bodies and the souls of men. Ben died in 1790 at the age of 84. Ben Franklin was quite a person. This portrait right here has this caption. It reads, In Paris, Franklin put aside his fine clothes he had worn in London. He dressed simply and carried a cane. Instead of a wig, he wore a fur cap to cover a rash on his scalp. To the French, he was the perfect representative of simple frontier people. They called him Le Bon Quaker, the good Quaker, although Ben was no Quaker and barely religious. Meanwhile, fur hats a la Franklin became all the rage. So he didn't wear the fancy wigs of the day, but since he had a rash on his head, he wore a little fur hat there. And then it became really cool. So this picture that spans both pages has this caption. French supporters gave the Americans a fighting ship. To honor Franklin, they named it the Bonhomme Richard, which is how Poor Richard was known in France. Oh, cool. Ben at a glance. 1706, he's born. 1718, apprenticed to his brother James. Remember in the printing press shop? 1730, Ben marries Deborah Reed. 2 years later, Ben publishes the first edition of Poor Richard's Almanac. 9 years later, he invents the Franklin stove. Another 9 years later, 11 years later, Ben performs his now famous kite experiment. A year later, he invents the lightning rod. 4 years later, Ben sails for England to state the complaints of the many colonists. Oh, let me start again. Ben sails to England to state the complaints of many of the colonies. Then in 1775, the Revolutionary War begins. That same year, he's appointed Postmaster General. A year later, Ben is part of the committee that writes the Declaration of Independence. He's selected to go to France to get French support for the revolution. And in 1784, Ben invents bifocals. This image here, Ben Franklin was born in this little house on Milk Street in Boston. His life's journey took him a long, long way from there. What an interesting man. We learn about him and his contributions to the war, his work as a statesman, many of his inventions, and work with lightning and electricity. We learned about his love of science and inventing, his work with printing and printing press, starting out with his brother, many of his contributions. That's our magazine. I'll catch you next time.